Let's dig into some of the myths from the mainstream medicine that might be ruining your health. And the first one, myth number one, saturated fat is bad for you. We, probably everyone in this seminar has heard this their entire lives. This hypothesis was first put forward really starting in the 1950s. And it started with a scientist by the name of Ancel Keys. Back in the 1950s, we were experiencing an epidemic of heart disease. The incidence of heart disease was rising rapidly. The sitting president of the United States, President Eisenhower, had a heart attack while he was in office, and this set off alarm bells, as it should. And there were a couple of competing theories at the time as to what was leading to this explosion in heart disease. Ancel Keys was a scientist who at the time was pushing the theory that saturated fat was the primary cause of heart disease. And in support of his theory, he published a paper. It's called the 6-Country Study. And what he did in that paper was he showed the consumption of saturated fat in 6 countries on the population level and their incidence of heart disease. And these 6 countries, there's a graph and it's a nice straight, line that shows a correlation that the more saturated fat that was consumed in a country, the more heart disease that they had. And this really, kind of cemented the hypothesis that saturated fat in the diet was leading to heart disease. The problem is that we now know that Ancel Keys had access to data from 22 countries, and he handpicked the 6 countries that lined up, and he ignored the other countries. Countries like France, that at the time had the highest consumption of saturated fat and the lowest incidence of heart disease. There have been many other studies put forward that purport to show a link between saturated fat and heart disease. Saturated fat has also been linked to cancer in studies now. But all of these studies are low quality evidence. They are what we call epidemiologic studies. And that's a real fancy word that basically means that they go around and they ask people what they eat, and they try and correlate that to certain health outcomes. And the problem is that those studies can only show correlation. They can't show causation. And those studies are very difficult to do in a rigorous scientific manner. Because I'm sure if I asked everyone in this room, what you ate yesterday, you might do a pretty good job at remembering. If I ask you what you ate over the past 3 months, 6 months, or even a year, you would probably be very inaccurate. And that's how these studies work. They usually ask, how many times did you eat a certain amount of food in the past 3 months? And they ask people to kind of estimate that. And then they use that to figure out, how much of the various components of food that we eat. And they try and correlate that to outcomes. Again, even these studies are well done, they can only show correlation, they can't show causation. The gold standard for scientific studies to prove causation is something we call the randomized controlled trial. And this is where we take a group of people, we take 2 groups of people, and we change one thing, and we compare the effects of changing that one thing in one group and not changing it in another group. Now, you can imagine it's pretty hard to do this for food because people don't eat the same exact thing except for one thing. It's very hard to change one thing in the diet without changing other things in the diet. There have been some randomized controlled studies that have looked at taking out saturated fat from the diet, putting in other types of fat. And those studies largely show no difference when it comes to heart health. Often, and actually probably what was the best done study of that kind actually showed that when you took saturated fat out of the diet, the group that you took away saturated fat had a higher mortality rate, died more often. So a bit problematic. To summarize saturated fat, there have been a number of recent, what we call meta-analyses. So again, fancy scientific word, meaning looking at all the studies that look at a topic and kind of summarizing what they find. And what they have found when it comes to saturated fat is that there is no link between saturated fat and heart disease. And many people do not realize that the American Heart Association has actually removed the limitation on saturated fat from their dietary recommendations. The US dietary guidelines have removed the limitation on saturated fat from their dietary guidelines. And there's really no reason that we should be avoiding saturated fat in our diet, especially the natural saturated fats that occur in animal products and in plant products. One of the other sort of interesting paradoxes about saturated fat is, for instance, you will oftentimes hear that coconut oil is good for your health. The same people that tell you that saturated fat is bad for you will tell you that, coconut oil, because it's a fruit oil, is good for your health. And yet saturated coconut oil is actually higher in saturated fat than animal products are, meat, and other animal products. So this is a total myth. And quite frankly, what it has led to, the changes in food supply have been damaging to our health. So I believe this is a very dangerous myth.